Welcome to your online lecture for Chapter 9, where we'll cover the rest of the writings in the Tanakh, namely Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Ruth, Esther, and Daniel. Last time, when we looked at the prophets, we had left off with the leaders of Judah taken into exile to Babylon, leaving behind Jerusalem in ruins and a disheartened populace. Though some prophetic and historical writings pass judgment on the people for national sins, there are some prophets that hold out hope for restoration, namely 2nd Isaiah chapters 40 to 55, Jeremiah chapter 33, and Ezekiel chapter 36. I invite you to take a moment now to read through one of those citations. The exile began in the 590s, and by the 550s BCE, Babylon experienced decline. Part of the decline could be attributed to the reduction of the power of the Marduk priesthood by Nabonidus. Cyrus's rise to power came about because of this decline in power, but also because of Cyrus's mastery of propaganda. For example, he claimed that Marduk had called him to come and rescue Babylon from evil clutches of irreligious usurpers. We have also seen Cyrus's tolerance of other religions and his allowance for the return of exiles. These factors contributed to the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Interestingly, some exiles chose to stay in Babylon. After all, it was a cosmopolitan city, the New York of its time. As a result, Babylon became an important center for Jewish religious learning. A long journey through desert faced exiles who returned. They came back to a ravaged land. The book of Jeremiah puts the number at 4,600 deportees. Biblical historians agree that the majority of these exiles were the upper echelons of Jewish society. The lower class and peasants remained in Israel. Jerusalem's wall is in ruins, though Jeremiah speaks of people still bringing offerings to the temple site. In antiquity, as well as other periods in history, city walls were considered to be an important fortification protecting the people. It also had a psychological barrier and protection that it afforded. The reconstruction could be viewed in three stages: the rebuilding of the temple, the rebuilding of the walls, and the completion of the Pentateuch. The reconstruction of the Second Temple began immediately, after the first group of returnees arrived. This languished for some periods, but it continued especially during the reign of King Herod in the 30s BCE. The temple still constituted the common focus of Jewish spirituality. It had not yet become the religion of the book. Rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem was important in order to defend the city. Nehemiah, a Jewish civil servant in the Persian Empire, requested and received support to fortify the city. He supervised its reconstruction. Nehemiah represents the reconstruction of Jewish civic life. Ezra was a priest and a scribe skilled in the Torah of Moses. He was a central figure in the restoration of the Torah. He returned to Jerusalem armed with royal warrants to revivify the worship of the Jerusalem temple. Ezra's efforts marked a significant step on the road toward Torah-centered piety. And so with Ezra and Nehemiah, we have two main elements of Jewish life returning and being restored. We'll return to Ezra and Nehemiah, following a few significant historical points in the ancient Near East surrounding this period. Alexander the Great's meteoric rise began with the assassination of his own father, Philip II of Macedon, in 336 BCE. He and his forces marched from Europe into Asia, south to Egypt and Libya, and back to Babylon, Persia, and eastward to the Indus Valley before a reluctant turn homeward. There have been a number of movies made about Alexander the Great and his conquest, most notably in 2004, a movie called Alexander starring Colin Farrell. Although the history is revised, you can still get a sense of the history in general. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, at age 33, his empire was ruled by four feuding generals. Ptolemy had established a dynasty in Egypt, and Seleucus established a dynasty in Babylon and Syria. Israel was caught in between, but finally fell to the Seleucids. This map shows the extent of Alexander the Great's empire. Notice the four kingdoms which comprise the entire empire. Notice as well Israel, caught in between the two kingdoms of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Change was in the air as Alexander became a proponent of Greek language and Hellenic culture. They built cities in Greek fashion with temples, theaters, gymnasiums, libraries, and Greek-style dwellings. Alexander established Alexandria in Egypt, and it soon overshadowed Athens as the intellectual capital of the Greek-speaking world. Jews were invited, and soon it would become a prosperous community like that in Babylon. The Jews of Alexandria would spawn the Septuagint and a great philosopher known as Philo. Greek culture infiltrated Jewish life in Israel. By early in the 2nd century BCE, some prominent Jewish priests were beginning to use Greek names. There was a theater, a stadium, and a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Eventually, Hellenistic culture came into bruising contact with traditional Jewish belief and practice. In the Tanakh, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are considered one work. Ezra Nehemiah portrays the restoration not only of people to their land, but also of the level of devotion to the Lord reminiscent of the time of King David. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are also considered one work because of stylistic similarities. Contemporary biblical scholars view this as the work of a single author or school, known as the chronicler. Considered together, it tells a story that begins at creation, skips quickly to David, and ends with the establishment of the Jewish province of Judea under priestly leadership. The books show how the nation prospered when there were rulers who were concerned with the proper worship of the Lord. When this high level of devotion to the Lord faltered, the nation weakened until disaster struck and the temple was destroyed. The biblical scholar Paul Hooker summarizes what Chronicles is all about in 4 points. First, God is active in human history and especially in the history of Israel. For the chronicler, history is the stage on which is acted out the drama of divine grace and command. Both the grace and the command have their roots in the very beginnings of humankind and are traceable through the long genealogy of the people of Israel and Judah, but they flower most fully in the dynasty of David in the southern kingdom of Judah. Second, God calls a particular people, Israel, into special relationship. From the beginning of his work, the chronicler argues that the call of Israel into relationship with God lies at the heart of God's intention for creation. The genealogies of 1 Chronicles chapters 1 to 9 make the point by their gradual narrowing of focus, beginning with the origins of humankind and proceeding to the selection of a single family, the descendants of Jacob, through whom the story will proceed. The sense conveyed here is that the emergence of Israel onto the world scene is the result of the divine plan for the human race and the center of human history. Third, God chooses a particular person, David, and through him a family, the house of David, as the agents of the divine will. Just as the genealogies focus the action of God from the large scope of the human race down to the descendants of Jacob, so the rest of the chronicler's narrative focuses the weal and woe of Israel onto the affairs of the family of David. As goes the house of David, so goes Israel. Although the kingship of Saul is recognized briefly in 1 Chronicles 10, it is obvious from the chronicler's dramatic presentation that the story of the kingdom of Israel actually begins in truth when God turned the kingdom over to David. Fourth, God chooses a particular place in which to be worshipped, the temple in Jerusalem. A central piece of the chronicler's presentation of Israel's story is his careful attention to the temple. More time and space are lavished upon the details of the temple construction and the practice of worship within it than any other subject. Fifth, God is still active in the story of Israel. Chronicles acts as a bridge between past and present. Chronicles tells the story of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah from the perspective of a later era, but the principal thrust of the work is not merely historical. Rather, the chronicler provides a continuity between the storied past of his nation and the present predicament of his people. The institutions and theology of the past are used to legitimate and give foundation to those of the present, and the practices of the present are seen as having their origins in the past. Seen in this light, Many biblical scholars cast doubt on the historicity of Chronicles. However, for a person of faith, we should not conclude that it has no historical value at all. To do so would be to forget that Chronicles provides us a window on the theological, political, and social concerns of the post-exilic community in and around Jerusalem. In Chronicles, we can come to understand something of the way the ancient community used the resources of its own past to address the crises of its present. This knowledge may finally be of greater value than the Chronicles story itself, especially if it teaches us something about how we might mine the treasures of our biblical heritage for guidance in facing our own crises of faith and practice. In the end, Chronicles may well serve us better in teaching method than in teaching history. Let's keep this history in mind as we shift our focus to the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is set during the period of the Judges. It is the story of the foreign woman who was the great-grandmother of King David. On two levels, Ruth is a story of redemption. On the one hand, it is the story of how two courageous women succeed in winning the legal right of redemption. That is, the law that states that if a man died without any sons, it became the responsibility of the nearest male relative to marry his widow and sire a son who would be the legal son of the deceased kinsman. Naomi and Ruth created the circumstances that caused Boaz to recognize and fulfill his kinship responsibility. On another level, the book of Ruth is the deeply moving tale of the selfless love of Ruth who redeems a broken and bitter Naomi. There is no law requiring Ruth to stay by Naomi's side, but Ruth is stubbornly devoted to her mother-in-law during her time of grief and restore hope when all seems lost. Let's turn our attention now to the book of Esther. There are a number of similarities between the books of Ruth and Esther. Both are part of the festival scrolls. They're read each year in the Jewish liturgical calendar. Both are found in the historical books in the Christian canon. Both are short stories about courageous women whose actions have far-reaching consequences for their people. Both are set loosely in historical contexts. And in both books, God is not an onstage character. The Book of Esther is a potboiler, a tale full of intrigue, violence, and dramatic action. There are several themes: the gaining of power by Jews in a situation of powerlessness, the importance of loyalty to the Jewish community over fidelity to unjust powers, and the underlying pattern beyond the level of human intrigue. As we hear a summary of the story, I invite you to consider what theme is prominent for you. The story begins with the king of the Persian Empire, Ahasuerus, throwing a lavish party. On the final day of the festivities, he called for his queen Vashti, eager to flaunt her beauty to his guests. But the queen refused to appear before Ahasuerus. Filled with anger, he deposed Queen Vashti forever, removing her from his presence. Feminist biblical scholars see Vashti's refusal as a significant act of disobedience. And so the king sets out to find his new queen. Ahasuerus hosts a royal beauty pageant. One of those presented is the orphan Esther, whose Jewish name is Hadassah. After the death of her parents, she was fostered by her cousin Mordecai. She finds favor in the king's eyes and is made his new queen. Esther, though, does not reveal that she is Jewish. In the Jewish Bible, we've come to see that names have significance. Esther, interestingly, is derived from the word for hiddenness, and Hadassah implies righteousness. Soon after, Mordecai uncovered a plot to assassinate the king. He told Esther about the conspiracy, and she reported it to Ahasuerus, giving credit to Mordecai. The plot was thwarted, and Mordecai's service is recorded. At the same time, the king's highest official was a wicked man named Haman. He hated the Jews, and he especially hated Mordecai, who had refused to bow down to him. So Haman devised a scheme to have every Jew in Persia killed. The king bought into the plot and agreed to annihilate the Jewish people on a specific day. Notice the contrast here between Haman and Mordecai. Meanwhile, Mordecai learns of the plan and shared it with Esther, challenging her with notable words. The book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 13 to 14. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." And so with those words, Esther urged all of the Jews to fast and pray for deliverance. Then, risking her own life, brave young Esther approached the king with a plan of her own. She invited Ahasuerus and Haman to a banquet where eventually she revealed her Jewish heritage to the king, as well as Haman's diabolical plot to have her and her people killed. Overcome by rage, Ahasuerus leaves the room. Meanwhile, Haman stays behind and begs Esther for his life, falling upon her in desperation. The king comes back at this moment and thinks Haman is assaulting the queen. This makes him angrier than before, and he orders Haman hanged on the gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. The previous decree against the Jews cannot be annulled, but the king allows the Jews to defend themselves during attacks. As a result, on 13 Adar, 500 attackers and Haman's 10 sons are killed in Shushan, followed by a Jewish slaughter of 75,000 Persians, although they took no plunder. Esther sends a letter instituting an annual commemoration of the Jewish people's redemption in a holiday called Purim, the Feast of Lots. Ahasuerus remains very powerful and continues reigning with Mordecai, assuming a prominent position in his court. To this day, many Jews celebrate the Feast of Purim, where the story of Esther is remembered. In many ways, it's a story of how to live righteously with God in a foreign land. The story of Esther is full of reversals and ironies. For example, Queen Vashti is punished for refusing to appear before the king when he has requested her presence. Queen Esther is rewarded for appearing without being asked. The story has a number of interesting coincidences. For example, the king had happened to read of Mordecai's loyalty just as Haman was plotting to kill him. This could indicate a divine pattern of events, with the purpose of the Lord saving his people. And finally, we turn our attention now to the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, we encounter a new type of literature, apocalyptic literature, from the Greek word for a revealing. Apocalypses are unveilings of things to come, revelations of the pattern of events that will lead to the end of the present historical age and the beginning of a new age. Apocalyptic literature is highly symbolic, and so is difficult to understand and susceptible to manipulation by interpreters who feel they have discovered the key to unlock its mysteries. Besides the book of Daniel, we can find apocalyptic literature elsewhere in the Tanakh, especially Isaiah chapters 24 to 27, Ezekiel chapters 38 to 48, Zechariah chapters 9 to 14, and Joel chapter 3. In the New Testament, we especially find apocalyptic literature in the Revelation of John, the final book in the Bible. But we can also detect apocalyptic language in the following passages: in Mark 13, Matthew chapters 24 to 25, Luke chapter 21, 1 Corinthians 15, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, the letter of Jude, and second letter of Peter. There's also a number of apocalyptic works in the Jewish literature after the Tanakh. There are several characteristics of apocalyptic literature. They report visions from God concerning events that will climax in the vanquishing of the forces of evil and the establishment of righteousness. They portray the end of the present age and the dawn of a new age. The present age is perceived to be under the dominion of evil, whether human or demonic in origin. The new age is sometimes called the kingdom of God. Apocalyptic visions typically reveal a series of cataclysmic events leading to a final climax in which God acts directly to end the old age and begin the new. There are a number of paired opposites in apocalyptic literature. For example, this age and the next, forces of good and evil, heaven and earth. The highly symbolic imagery constitutes a secret code that, when deciphered, reveals to the faithful the truth about the end and the events leading to it. When the recipients of these visions are named, they become heroes of faith who have shown their righteousness. They receive visions, usually in a trance state, often with interpretations by an angel. They are usually instructed to seal them up until the end time. Apocalyptic literature often speaks of life beyond death, ensuring that the righteous who die before the end of the present age will not be denied their place in the kingdom, and that the wicked will receive their punishment. There is also mention of the agent who will rule in the new age for God. Today, as in the past, Christians and other people of faith have interpreted apocalyptic literature in a variety of ways. I invite you to do a quick search on Wikipedia under the heading The Book of Revelation, particularly How Religions Interpret Apocalyptic Literature, and consider how you would interpret apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic movements and literature developed in Judaism at times of persecution and crisis, when hope seemed lost. In the next chapter, we'll look at the conditions that brought about the book of Daniel. These movements were often alienated from traditional teachings and institutions, and so took refuge in the symbolic universe of the visions they believed. The Qumran community of the Dead Sea Scrolls was part of this type of movement, and withdrew from society to prepare itself for a final battle between light and darkness. Some early Christian communities were apocalyptic groups, believing that Jesus would return soon to inaugurate God's kingdom. Today, Christian apocalyptic groups strongly believe that the canonical apocalypses, namely the Book of Daniel and the Book of Revelation, point to the present era as the end time. One such group are the Seventh-day Adventists. In the Hebrew canon, the placement of the Book of Daniel indicates that it is a different type of literature, and it was completed after the prophetic canon was closed. This was made explicit by rabbinic sources. Turning now to the literary structure of the Book of Daniel, we see that there are two distinct sections. Chapters 1 to 6 are legends about Daniel and three friends who are presented as deportees to Babylon. Chapters 7 to 12 is a collection of apocalyptic visions, with interpretations by angels received and written down by Daniel. An example of a legend about Daniel is the beloved story about Daniel in the lion's den, in chapter 6 of the book of Daniel. I invite you to take some time now to read that short story. The first section of the book of Daniel has a familiar ring. Daniel, like Joseph, is a handsome young man who demonstrates allegiance to God when tested and rises to influence in a foreign court because of his skill as an interpreter of dreams. The legends of Daniel chapters 1 and to 6 are instructive, giving a model of persons in situations of crisis displaying exemplary behavior. The message is that if you maintain loyalty in the face of persecution, everything will work out in the end. At the conclusion, Daniel is told that the words are to remain secret and sealed until the time of the end, when those who are wise will understand, but the wicked will not. The visions are graphic symbols of the unfolding of history from the time of Daniel to the end. The imagery has been encountered before, one like a son of man, or human being, coming on the clouds of heaven to the throne of the Ancient of Days. We have seen this in Psalm 104, verse 3. In another vision, Daniel chapter 9, Daniel learns from the angel Gabriel that the true meaning of Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years of exile is 70 weeks of years. This type of scriptural commentary is a typical apocalyptic technique based on the assumption that hidden in Scripture are keys that will reveal the secrets of the end time. In chapter 12, Daniel is reassured by Gabriel that when the present age draws to a close, Michael, Israel's guardian angel, will arise and the righteous will be victorious. The second half of Daniel is dated by modern interpreters more precisely than any other sections of the Bible on the basis of external and internal evidence. Externally, the book is not among the prophets, so it is most likely post-4th century BCE. It is first mentioned in a work that dates about 140 BCE. The book is not mentioned in Ben Sirach, circa 190 to 180 BCE. Internally, both the legends and the visions include unhistoric elements concerning Daniel's punitive time, such as a Median empire and a ruler, Darius the Mede. The visions also lead up step by step to the profanation of the Jewish temple by the Seleucid ruler Antiochus Epiphanes, which took place in 167 BCE. At first glance, one might think that the book of Daniel was a product of the Babylonian exile. After all, the court tales begin under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king responsible for the deportation of Judeans to Babylon in the early 6th century. But reading the court tales of chapters 1 to 6 openly signal to readers that they are folk tales, not history, and should therefore not be taken as indication of the book's date of composition. A more obvious indicator of the book's date, though, is the nature of the historical apocalypses we encounter in chapters 7 to 12. In establishing Daniel's credibility as a visionary of the author and audience's future, they time and time again assign to him the task of envisioning accurately his future, which is the receiving audience's past. We call this phenomenon ex eventu prophecy, that is, prophecy of an event after an occurrence. The method of dating that looks at internal and external evidence reflects the modern view that apocalypses are frequently pseudonymous works, that is, attributed to one source but actually coming from another. In the case of Daniel, this means that the visions are a literary creation, written during the Antiochian persecution to inspire hope. The visions, combined with the legends of the righteousness of Daniel as a model of piety in the face of persecution, could indicate that there was an identifiable group within Judaism known as the Hasidim, or faithful ones. They were dedicated to maintaining traditional practices. When Antiochus enforced Hellenistic ways and outlawed Jewish practices, the Hasidim practiced passive resistance. The consensus of modern historians is that the Hasidims were the apocalyptic community from which Daniel was written.